What is good for one is not always good for another. The suicide bomber and the pacifist have very different notions of the good. Is this because there's no meaning to good and evil, no ultimate meaning to good and evil? Can good perhaps be found in the practical outcomes of action? Or might instead good be found in the desire to escape from the limitations of human action by striving for something ultimate, even if it can't be achieved? So that's the debate that we're going to be having this morning, and with me, three very distinguished philosophers to help explore this mystery of the good. Naomi Goulder, who is head of philosophy at the New College of Humanities in London. Paul Boghossian was a key figure in the development of the philosophy department at NYU, is director of the New York Institute of Philosophy. And Michael Ruse, who is born in the UK, but now teaches at Florida State University and specializes in the relationship between religion and science. He's author of On Purpose and Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? Should we strive for an ultimate goodness? Naomi.
Okay, well, I don't think that we should strive for an ultimate goodness in anything like the sense that has been traditionally thought by philosophers. Aristotle said that the ultimate good would be what we all strived for, and it would be what we valued for its own sake. So you might think that money is good, or money might be good in order to buy a house, and that might be good. But ultimately, what are you striving for? He thought everyone would agree it would be happiness. That got taken up very much under the idea of pleasure. But most philosophers in the tradition talking about the ultimate good have meant it in the context of moral goodness. And the idea there was that you would be striving to maximize, in some sense, the total amount of happiness or pleasure, so that the individual, if they were going to act well and to pursue the ultimate good, would have to sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of the total community. Utilitarianism would be an example of that view that would say that was the ultimately good way to proceed. Now, I'm going to agree with Nietzsche that there is something suspicious about this rhetoric of the ultimate good being about denying your own happiness for the sake of others. I think that it is ultimately, as he says, a bit of ideology used to beguile individuals who could be pursuing their own flourishing into pursuing other people's. And I agree with him that it can really only be acted on out of some sort of a deceptive belief, a belief in something that we don't now think is mostly true, a belief in God with an afterlife, an ability to punish and reward us for what we do. Elizabeth Anscombe said that to believe in these moral concepts in this current in this when we no longer believe in God would be like believing in criminals after the concept of criminal law and all of the law courts had disappeared. Okay, so here's Nietzsche, and this is to say against the common notion of good, which is about self-sacrifice and for the sake of others. Our weak and unmanly social concepts of good and evil and their tremendous ascendancy have finally weakened all bodies and souls and sapped the self-reliant, independent, unprejudiced men. The idea of the good is a seduction, a poison, a narcotic, so that morality itself is the danger of dangers. Okay, so there's the negative. I don't think we need the current idea of good, but I think that we do need ideas of value. And it's no good just saying, oh, we'll just go back to satisfying our preferences, not think in terms of value at all. We need to be able to believe in values and commit ourselves to values in order to unify our lives across time and to get rid of a sense that we are merely the victims of desires that assail us. We need to have some control, and that requires thinking in evaluative terms. I'll talk a little more perhaps later in the discussion about what those evaluative terms might be, if not these other regarding self-denying ones. But I think that Nietzsche was onto something with the idea that they would be much more like aesthetic categories, categories of the interesting, categories of the deep, or might be something like that. So we need to pursue an ultimate good, but it might be a good that is a good of the value of interest rather than of morality.
Thank you, Naomi. Paul.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll pick up on a point of agreement that we do need to believe in values, and in fact, I will argue believe in values that we regard to be objectively correct. Though I wouldn't give an argument of the kind that Naomi was alluding to, that we need to believe in them for instrumental reasons because they somehow do something for us, they unify us, or they allow us to act, or they allow us to have certain kind of social cohesion, or whatever it is. Rather, it's because they're real, and we recognize them as real, and in fact it's very hard for us to dispense with a certain measure of what I'll call normative objectivism, or objectivism about value. And the way to see this is just to consider something that you already believe, a normative belief that you have. For instance, that it is morally right or morally good to educate girls and young women. And you consider yourself having a dispute. There are people who dispute this. Not everybody agrees to this. And you can have one of three attitudes, it seems to me, if we really boil it down. One of them is to think that that kind of statement, it is morally good to educate girls and young women, is the kind of thing that can be simply true or false, and there is something in virtue of which it's true or false. That thing in virtue of which it's true or false need not itself be a simple thing. Maybe there's a more general principle from which it derives, but ultimately there will be some normative claim at the bottom of that chain of reasoning which will have to be either true or false. And you'll have to have some conception of what makes it true or false. Another attitude you could take is what you might call a relativistic one, in which you think, well, that's something that's, as it were, true for me or right for us in our context, but it needn't be right for somebody else in some other context. In particular, if we look right now on the globe at the people who think that girls and young women should not be educated, well, that's the appropriate thing for them. And finally, the third attitude you could have is what I'll call a nihilistic one, in which you think really normative vocabulary is fundamentally confused. There is nothing in the world that it answers to. If you really want to do things right, you just have to drop this vocabulary and find some other vocabulary, not itself normative, not itself evaluative, in which to describe these things that we call moral convictions or moral beliefs. And of course, the only real alternative here is something like preferences. People can have preferences. I would prefer to live in a world in which girls and young women are educated. But of course, you'll have to, if that's all you have to say, then you'll have to give some explanation for why the other person's preferences are not given equal weight. What makes your preferences so special? And the other thing is that, in fact, when you examine your own conviction about these, the conviction about things that matter to you, I mean, to use another chestnut, I use it because I was going to say who could dispute it, but I actually did come across somebody who disputed it once. I mean, that's the thing about philosophy. There's no view that's so crazy that somebody hasn't tried to defend it. But the chestnut is, it is wrong to torture babies for your own pleasure. Okay. And when I said this, and I said, well, because somebody said, give me an example of an unqualified absolute truth. And I said this one, and she said, how much pleasure? I said, well, it drew a gasp from the room. But you see, that's very significant. Look, that's nuts. Okay. And so when you examine a conviction like that, and you ask yourself, could you capture what you want to say about this just by saying, I prefer this? The answer is no. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Paul. Michael.
So let me start by saying that I don't accept that absolute notion of the good, but I do think that those of us who don't accept it should at least start by taking it very seriously. I think that if you don't take it very seriously, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. And as I see it, there are obviously two ways that one could have an absolute good, an objective good, a good which is in the forest when there's no one around to suffer from it. So the one would be religious, and presumably in a theistic situation it would be at least the will of God, or as endorsed by God, or something like that. I don't think this is a silly answer. And I think that if you did believe in a God which was good, then obviously you're going to find morality somehow involved in it. The other position is something like Platonism, where one believes in some kind of objective reality, the objective reality where you find the truths of mathematics, for instance, never was created, never will go, In fact, it's outside time in that sort of sense. Doesn't make sense to say, when did 2 plus 2 first start to equal 4? When will it stop equaling 4? It's that kind of question is just not on.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.